this tension between allowing this sector to operate as a market versus as a service that is the rights of every citizen is something that needs to be better managed. We cannot keep on changing directions every 5 years.
A lot of work focus needs to be driven towards local content and having a robust framework around that.
We need to be making bankable, data-driven decisions. The visibility that's going to come from the digitization we can achieve and time will help us make the right calls so we don't turn this into more of an academic exercise versus one of personal passions and interest.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this episode of What's with the Grid, a conversation with women in the power sector. This episode is dedicated to some very intelligent, very impressive people in the private sector who just happen to be women. Very smart, articulate women, I might say. And salutations to each of them. We're going to be unpicking their perspectives about Nigeria's power sector and comparing that with some of the experiences they've had in power sectors or energy sectors in other parts of the world. And there are three of them here in no particular order. We have Catherine Ashenuga-Farrer, the CEO of Trennco Towers. Trennco Towers is a company specializing in transforming transmission sector assets across West Africa. Catherine holds an economics degree from the University of Reading in England. She's a member of the Securities Institute in England and Wales. She actually started her career as a private banker at Barclays Private Bank in London, managing a portfolio of private banking clients on the West African team. She provided wealth management services and advised private clients on business strategy and fiduciary services. Catherine's area of expertise was an international business development, particularly in the energy sector in West Africa. Catherine, you are very welcome. Thank you so much for making out the time, and we look forward to hearing a bit more about this really impressive resume of yours.
Thank you very much, Stella. Thank you. Lovely to be here.
Thank you. Also here, another Amazon in her own right, the CEO and founder of Shyft Power Solutions, Ugwem Eneyo. She's a Nigerian-American engineer, inventor, and entrepreneur. Really interesting combination going on there, and impressive as well. She is the co-founder and the CEO of Shyft Power Solutions, a venture-backed, award-winning energy technology company, which is actually a byproduct of her research as a former Stanford MS PhD student in civil and environmental engineering. Headquartered in Oakland, California, with a subsidiary in Lagos, Nigeria, Shyft Power Solutions is an energy technology company that develops IoT and software solutions to connect and intelligently manage distributed energy resources like solar and energy storage in markets that struggle with grid reliability and resilience. Hello, Nigeria. Thank you, Ugwem, for being here. Look forward to hearing what you have to say about all of this.
It's great to be here. Excited for the conversation.
Thank you. And then last but very certainly not the least, we have civil engineering alumna from the University College London and a member of the Women on the Grid Hub, Hassana Aliyu, the Vice President of Operations at Konnexa. Konnexa is a pioneering integrated utility company that accelerates access to reliable power for all by leveraging cost-efficient and disruptive technologies. I have a question about that. So at Konnexa, Hassana leads on regulations, compliance, and government relations, as well as technical and business development. Her work has included development of on-grid and embedded renewable generation, but she has previously worked in construction, management on large-scale rail development projects with London Underground and Network Rail, including CTRL St Pancras redevelopment, Wood Lane Station, the first new London tube station on an existing line for 70 years, and the Thameslink programme Farringdon Station redevelopment. Now, there's so much more going on with Hassana's CV, but maybe we'll hear a bit more about it when the conversation starts. Thank you very much, Hassana, for making out the time.
Thank you, Stella. Great to be here.
All right, so let's get this conversation going. Catherine, what on earth are you doing in the transmission space? How did you get from Barclays to transmission, that difficult space?
Okay, so yes, Barclays, I was a private banker and I looked after a portfolio of West African clients. I would say 90% of my clients were Nigerian. So they were, all high net worth individuals doing various interesting, impactful, exciting things within their sector. And I hadn't been Nigerian, obviously, but I hadn't been to Nigeria in sort of 17, 18 years at that point. And so managing their portfolios and just finding out all about the interesting things that were going on in Nigeria at the time, I sort of thought, well, maybe I should head back home and see what type of opportunities exist. I wasn't quite sure then whether it would be power, what it would be, but I sort of had the entrepreneurial itch and bug. And I think I'd mentioned, Stella, in our last conversation that I come from a long line of female entrepreneurs, my mother, my grandmother as well before her. So I made the move. I mean, I didn't just sort of like leap blindly into Nigeria. I had spoken to some of my clients and I'd said, especially in the energy sector, and I'd said, well, I'm thinking about coming to Nigeria. You know, it'd be lovely to have a soft landing. Don't just want to quit my private banking job and come to Nigeria and start crying. They said, listen, come home. You're a private banker. Obviously, you understand finance and financial structuring. We have assets that we want to monetize. We're not quite sure how we can do that. So you can come home and provide some type of consultancy services for us, knock on our doors. And they stuck to their word. So I came back home and initially started Trennco as a consultancy outfit. So we would look at different portfolios for clients and give some advisory, do some advisory work and you know, charge a fee for that. And we sort of started looking also at the downstream trading sector within oil and gas. So we played in that space for a few years, Stella, until I think you had a change of power, change of regulation, and it quickly became clear that the sort of support we'd had up to then was sort of not going to be there any longer. So I started to think, well, what to do? I definitely did not want to go back to the UK. I think I caught the Nigerian bug and I wanted to stay home. So I spoke with my father. My parents live in the UK, and we sort of rubbed minds. And he said, listen, why don't you look at the power sector? Just to give a bit of context, my father used to be in NEPA many moons ago. He's 94 years old now, so we're talking a long time ago.
Oh,
But
wow.
the power sector, it's a growing space. It's a place that there are always opportunities to add value, to grow, to create different type of things. Why not look at that? So we started looking at the power sector. Looked at generation, we looked at transmission, and we looked at distribution. And we sort of settled on transmission because for me, I believe that the transmission sector is a critical part of the power supply value chain. If you generate, you can generate as much as you want, but if you don't have that robust transmission infrastructure and grid stability to move or wheel your power, then really it's captured power. It doesn't get to where it needs to get to, etc. So we said, right, let's start having a look at transmission. And so we knocked on some doors and we said, listen, we want to play in this space. It's still the transmission sector, it's still owned 100% by the government. So that came with its own peculiar challenges.
And hence my curiosity.
As I'm sure that you know, but we knocked on some doors, and I think that's why, you know, Nigerian elders, they always say a good name is worth more than silver and gold. You know, I would mention my name and say, you remember your father, Engineer Ashenuga? He was the director of electrical engineering back in the NEPA days in Marina and Lagos. Come into our offices. So they were very warm and inviting. And that's how we started as an EPC company. So my company is actually called Trennco Power. Trennco Towers is our backward integrated project, which I'll speak a bit on as the conversation progresses. So that's how I got in the sector, Stella, doing engineering, procurement, and construction work on behalf of
You're
the
not an engineer, though.
No, I'm not. I studied economics at Reading. So people sometimes always say, yes, are you know, so no, I'm not an engineer, but I do understand about the power space in as much as I can. Obviously, if you get very technical with me going into wattage and the voltage, then I defer to my engineers. But I understand how to grow business, how to add value, and, you know, see when there are opportunities, the best strategic way to take advantage of those opportunities.
Impressive.
So that's how I got into the space, and we've been doing that for several years now.
How many?
I would say almost 10 years. Almost 10
done.
years. Yes, almost 10
Well
years.
done. Like double thumbs up.
Thank you,
Wow.
Stella. And it's been, I think, along the course of our 10 years, we found that the way that we grow transmission infrastructure in this country It's very inefficient. It hampers the speed at which you're able to execute projects. And really, this is for me, it's really, this is very close to my heart. It's purely because we don't have those capacities, or we haven't developed those capacities in country to say we can grow a vibrant transmission infrastructure sector. So about, I think just after COVID, maybe we started looking at it critically. For example, all the inputs that I need for projects I import from India or I import from China. Some people go to Turkey because I can't source these locally in Nigeria. And this has been happening even when my father was, so we're talking years and years and years. And I said, I started dialoguing with stakeholders within the sector, other EPC companies like myself, and saying, listen, why don't we have a local manufacturing fabrication, this type of outfit in country that we can look to, because the sector is obviously growing. When you look at some of the numbers in terms of access to electricity in Nigeria, we still have a long way to go. I always use South Africa to give some context. They're about a sixth of the population size of Nigeria. However, they generate 6 times more power than what we do. So there's a huge gap, and there are these different initiatives that are trying to address that gap. So for me, there's obviously huge demand that will come off the back of these growth initiatives. So we started thinking, what are some of the things that we can do, et cetera, et cetera. So we do have a project that we're hopefully going to kick off Q1, Q2 next year that addresses that. So in a nutshell, that's how I got to this stage. That's how I got to
Thank you. Very, I'd say that was a medium-sized nutshell, but very, very important nutshell nevertheless. I mean, it's quite impressive. I'll pivot to Ugwem now. There's something to say about, when I said you're not an engineer, Catherine, and then you said, I'm not, but I understand how to grow a business. I know how to spot opportunity. I know how to leverage. I mean, that really resonated with me. And I'm wondering, Ugwem, whether did that also inform your own pathway, how you got to where you are now as CEO of a company that's doing amazing things in a space that is, at least within the African context, male dominated. What's your journey been like?
It's certainly been a journey. And yes, I think the idea of being an engineer to entrepreneur wasn't immediately what I thought my path would be. My journey to Shyft really started coming from childhood. So as a Nigerian American being shuttled back and forth between the US and Nigeria, growing up, specifically the Niger Delta, I had a very strong interest in the nexus of development, sustainability, infrastructure, and the environment. What does infrastructure and development do to people, and what does it do to the environment? And so my career and academic journey very much reflected that work. Ironically, I got started in the oil and gas industry after finishing a degree in civil and environmental engineering, really focusing on risk management. So how do we think about execution risk and better plan and develop projects to, again, support communities, but also be mindful of environmental, socioeconomic impacts and being mindful of sustainability. At the time I was doing that work, there was a lot happening in the academic sphere when it comes to battery and solar technology and thinking about the future of the grid. Decentralization and digitization of just about every sector was at the forefront of many conversations. So I actually took a leave from my work in oil and gas and went back to Stanford to work on a PhD looking at what the future of power and electricity grids will be. And ironically, it started off, at the time, a decade ago, so much of the conversation was about distributed energy resources, distributed solar, utility scale battery storage in the context of the US, of Europe, Australia. And not as much was going into thinking about, well, what does this mean for emerging markets where there is a gap that needs to be met and where we're not looking at disrupting existing infrastructure, we're looking at complementing and augmenting existing centralized grids. And so really my research focused on that. And I thought I was going to go into becoming a professor. I'm technical and into research by background. But if you know anything about engineering, we are the original problem solvers. That is the nature of what engineers do. And it became very intriguing to think about moving the intellectual property that we were working on at Stanford to commercializing it. And that's actually how Shyft Power Solution was birthed, by building IoT, so smart sensors and gateways, as well as proprietary algorithms to optimize the use of hybrid power systems. So in the early days, that's microgrids in both rural, commercial, utility scale type microgrid operations or embedded systems into the utility. And so we've been doing this now for several years. Nigeria is our largest market. Very excited to also announce that we just recently were acquired by Stemico, a UK-based energy technology company. And so we're now excited to join forces and continue to scale out digital transformation of Africa's power grid.
Well done. I'm actually just in awe. Like, I feel like listening to you ladies talk about your personal stories for the whole of the podcast, but there's so many questions to ask. And we'd really like to hear, Hassana, I know a bit about your story privately, but I'm sure the rest of the world would like to know. What was your own, why did you come back? Like, I mean, you did your studies, you doing good work overseas. Here you are in Abuja, yeah, big madam, nevertheless, but then here in Abuja, still here in Abuja. So, what was your guiding like? How did you get back here?
My journey back to Nigeria was very different. It was based on personal reasons. So at the time, my father was ill. So I decided, okay, now will be the time to make the transition back to Nigeria. My father was living in Nigeria. I was living in the UK, and he became ill. So I thought this is the time to start making the transition back to Nigeria. While I was in the UK, I had been working in infrastructure, mostly railway. And so when I came to Nigeria, I thought, okay, this is the path that I would continue on. So it was actually by accident that I fell into the power sector. So I had a friend of mine who so I came back to Nigeria. I did my NYC in construction, and then a friend of mine came to Nigeria, and he was interested in doing on-grid solar development. So he asked if I was interested joining the company with him, starting on this journey. This was like 2013, when privatization had just been completed, distribution, generation had gone into the private sector. So everyone was excited. It's a new sector. There's so much progress to be made. We were finally going to get this power sector right. So we were all excited. Renewable energy also at that time was pioneering. At that time, the regulator had come out with a feeding tariff regulation for renewables that had very attractive tariffs. So all of us sort of like ran into that space. So we started by looking into on-grid utility scale solar in Bauchi. And it was a journey that, this was, like I said, we started this in 2013, and this is a journey that till today has not been completed. And I'm sure you're aware of all the issues that have gone into trying to bring solar onto the grid. Back then, obviously, we had this structure where we had the embed as the bulk trader, and we were all developing these IPPs under the framework of getting PRGs, PCOAs, to try and make these projects bankable. But as the sector was developing and we started to see that the distribution was losing financial viability, there was all these constraints, bottlenecks. It wasn't developing in the way that we anticipated it would. So NBET and the federal government started to pull back on the ability to provide these guarantees to make these IPPs bankable. So as we were developing, we started to understand what the issues were developing within this newly privatized sector. Generation, I would say, is probably the part of the value chain that is easiest in terms of you set up your plant. As long as you have all the supporting infrastructure, you're good to push your power into the grid. So we now pivoted and said, okay, look, for generation to be able to do what it needs to do, we need to have a viable distribution system. So we now pivoted to start looking at investment in distribution, and this is how Konnexa was born. So previously, when we're doing generation in Bauchi, that was under a different company called Nigeria Solar Capital Partners. So the same shareholders in that company decided to pivot and look into doing some investment in distribution, and this is how Konnexa was born. So through Konnexa, we've developed this new model where we are making investments throughout the value chain. So we have a trading license, and under this our model, we identify viable customers, particularly customers who are looking to achieve net zero and transition away from like the dirtier fuels, like in some cases gas, to more renewables like solar and hydro. So we have this trading license, and through our trading license, we're now making investments in the customer side, in the distribution, in transmission, and also in generation. So we basically want to de-risk the value chain as much as possible by owning as much of the value chain as we possibly can. So if we know that we have our generation in control, we have transmission infrastructure able to deliver our power, we've done all the investment into distribution, so we are minimizing any unreliability and availability, and then making investment at the customer side. So when if any failure happens within the grid, the customer has the ability to transition to their own self-generation. Through these 10 years that we've been working in this sector, these are the things that we have identified as the issues that is preventing reliability to some of these more demanding customers. And we're putting this plan to make these investments throughout the value chain to ensure that as much as possible, we are reducing the unavailability, unreliability, but also ensuring that when all the redundancies we put in place have failed, the customer still has their final backup, which is self-generation.
Very interesting. I especially like the customer-centric tilt to the work that you do. Of course, in addition to the other technical issues let me just pick up on a statement you made. The generation subsector within the value chain is the easiest. I'll follow that up with something that gets said very often, that the transmission space is the toughest and it's the problem. Catherine?
In terms of the power sector, I think one of the questions or one of the things that had been sent with the power sector, the problem with Nigeria's power sector, and I suppose this feeds on into your question about transmission. I think if you look at the entire power supply value chain, generation, transmission, and distribution, there are unique challenges that are persistent along all three. So with generation, you have gas supply constraints, which I'm sure Hassana can speak to in terms of don't have enough gas, so you can't run your turbines, so you can't generate as much as you can. Within transmission, you have aging infrastructure, poorly managed infrastructure that's not been replaced.
Terrible bureaucracy.
The bureaucracy, funding, you haven't been able to attract the funding that you need to grow the sector. I mean, we've all heard and seen all the grid outages that have happened in the last few months. And then, of course, within distribution, you don't have cost-reflective tariffs, which makes it hard for the private sector to come in and place more investments into the sector when they're not sure about how their revenues can be protected or generated. So I would say that transmission, it's out of the three, I would say it presents very, very unique challenges.
That's a very polite way of putting it, Catherine.
Well, I don't know where this podcast is going to, so I'm trying to be very measured with my words.
I see that.
Trying to be very measured with my words. We have a heavy reliance on importation, like I mentioned, within the transmission space. And because the sector is still owned 100% by the government, there's very little private sector interventions, which is something that we are trying to push for. We've had dialogues with NERC in terms of local content. That's something we're extremely passionate about, that we need to have stronger regulatory frameworks around local content within the sector, like you have within oil and gas. In Nigeria, the Nigerian power sector and the transmission space, there's nothing that really speaks to, or well, there might be something, but nobody can really tell you, okay, what is local content within mission? What does it mean?
Yeah. At least not in the same way as oil and gas, I hear you.
No, it's not in the same way as oil and gas. So what does that mean? And we had a conversation with NERC a little while ago, and we're trying to sort of see how you can develop a framework around this as well. So I would say funding challenges, aging infrastructure, maybe some of the regulatory reforms or frameworks are quite opaque. So you're not quite sure what can be done, what is achievable, etc. And then I think another thing that sprung to mind when I saw some of these questions, Stella, that the power sector, you have so many overlapping agencies that you're not quite sure what does what. Some of the functions are duplicated. So as an example, you have TCN, you have the REA, you have NDPHC, you have FGN Power. So you have all these different initiatives, and some speaks to generation and transmission and distribution, and all of them sort of say they do the same thing. So I think streamlining some of these functions would definitely work in the sector. Okay, REA does this, TCN does this, or collapsing it under one body and saying, well, this is the agency that is responsible for X. So even as a private sector player wanting to come and bring in investments into the sector, you know who you will be dialoguing with. You're not having to run to 6 or 7 different agencies to get things done. So I think these are some of the challenges within the sector. Politics, if I dare add, have also created challenges. A lot of times, or quite often, you find that investments within the transmission space, they're arranged along geopolitical lines and not necessarily where the investments needs to get to. However, with this new administration, the Presidential Power Act, which now states that every state can generate, transmit, and distribute power, I think that will go a long way towards directing investments where they need to. So it's not just at the federal level. So these are some of the things that we found as operators within the sector. I think some of the reforms gathering momentum and certainly positive for us. So I think it's a case of digging in our heels, carry on, and again, keep in sight of our strategy to add value in the sector. There's a lot of growth that needs to happen. And I think, just from the things I've heard from Ugwem and Hassana in terms of innovation, those are the things that needs to drive efficiencies and drive further growth within the sector.
Agreed. Hassana, just to put you on notice, I'm coming back to you with this question of collapsing, and because I know you have some thoughts. But let me pivot to Ugwem now, who's doing admirable work, with ICT, with all of that. And I'm just wondering, Catherine says there's a lot of growth that needs to happen. I think we can all agree. But the work you're doing, when you look at the ICT gap in sub-Saharan Africa, how can what you're trying to do gain traction in places like Nigeria, for instance?
That's a great question. Well, fortunately, digital transformation of several sectors, including the power sector, has been at the forefront of a lot of conversations, especially when it comes to innovation. Since 2015 or so, grid-related investment into digital technologies has grown by over 50%. And when we talk about digital technologies for grid management, for demand management and grid stability, these are the solutions that will help address that gap. And I think part of the conversation that Shyft is having with our customers, who include everyone from developers, the IPPs, we recently began working more and having conversations with the discos, is really how to utilize that data. Everyone talks about big data, digital transformation, let's digitize all of our infrastructure, but how do we really tell the story about what that actually means, what the impact of that, how to utilize that data? It's very challenging to just say, let's make everything smart and not necessarily present the impact, the return on that investment. And I think that's a conversation that the sector is having, is alongside this concept of digital transformation. Well, how does that result in making better decisions? One of the things that we do quite a bit is how utilizing intelligence and what's happening at the feeder level, being able to do better detection of losses, a range of types of losses, how to actually act on that, how to assess that, how to use our solutions to use that data to also think about where to invest in infrastructure and what type of technologies to invest in infrastructure. We do this both in the grid sector, but also in the infrastructure sector, working with the telcos and folks who are operating microgrids basically at every tower, and need to think about, well, how are we going to better integrate cheaper, more reliable, and cleaner solutions? And again, I think the key part of bridging that gap is, well, when we're talking about digitizing this infrastructure, we also have to very much communicate and let them see the impact of that investment, the return of that investment, and what it means for our customers' operations and mostly their costs and reliability.
Impressive. Yeah, I hear you. I mean, the commitments that Nigeria has made within the policy context in the energy sector, I don't see us getting there without doing things smarter. This is where the digitization and all of that come in. But in some ways, and I'm pivoting to Hassana now because she's very rooted within these conversations in the past, in some ways that doesn't even come up in the discussions. It's almost as if we're dealing with more important issues, and it shouldn't be that. The digitization and doing things smarter is top of the list as far as I'm concerned, is as important as everything else. But then the sense you get when you sit in meetings, power sector meetings, is like, this is not top of the list. Do you get that impression as well, Hassana?
I think it has been identified as critical, but it's now a case of prioritization. There's very limited funding in this sector. Every segment of the value chain has financial constraint. So at this point, I think it's about prioritizing. But I believe that there are ways of including digitalization in every plan that you make. But I think part of the problem that we're seeing in this sector is, first of all, I think there's like a misalignment of priorities. And overarching this is the fact that this is now a sector that is supposed to be privatized, but government is still very much focused on the fact that as a government, it is their responsibility to provide a service to the people. And part of that service they're supposed to provide is power. So for them, that is a priority, give Nigerians power. But then you've privatized the sector, and it's like, as private players, their priority is to make a return on their investment. They have investors, they've taking loans, they need to repay these loans, they need to pay interest, they need to have a profit from all these investments that they've made. So this, I feel like this tension between allowing this sector to operate as a market versus as a service that is the rights of every citizen is something that needs to be better managed, better aligned. As a government, look, at the end of the day, yes, Nigerians will have to have power. As part of the development of the economy, we need to have power. But they need to also realize that then they need to make the interventions, and this will be financial interventions for them, to ensure that as private sector is allowed to do what they need to do to grow the sector and make a return on the investment. And if the government's priority is ensuring that every Nigerian has power and has affordable power, then they need to make the interventions, financial interventions, to make that happen. So this, first of all, I think this alignment is one thing that needs to be sorted out. The other thing is, even within the value chain, there is a misalignment between the regulator, between the transmission, distribution, generation.
Yeah.
At this point, we've
what
got to the
Catherine
point
was
where,
alluding to.
yeah, and I think we've got to the point where, because things have not worked according to the plan, everyone is now taking their own road towards making their business successful. So it's now fragmenting the sector in a way. I mean, sometimes I just feel like we need to come, all of us together, come back to the drawing board. We need to have a 50, 75-year plan for this power sector, and everybody needs to plug into it. And even if we, as private players with our own businesses, design the different models, very different varying models, at the end of the day, it needs to be a situation where we're all making a journey to the same destination. But at this point, it's like it feels like it's gotten to the point where everybody's destination is different. We're fragmented, and in this fragmented situation, it makes it even harder to bring in the large-scale investment that is needed to make this sector work. So at one point, when the privatization first happened, everything was about trying to expand the grid, expand its capacity, upgrade it. Now, then the conversation pivoted to, okay, the grid's not working. Let's now concentrate on mini grids, solar home systems, and that sector began to thrive in a way that the on-grid sector was lagging behind. And now the conversation has now come, okay, let's focus on decentralization. It's like, we cannot keep on changing directions every 5 years. We need to have a plan that is stable, it's long-term, and the destination, we can't keep shifting the goalposts. The goalposts have to remain fixed. Maybe the journey to get to those destination might change, but the destination cannot keep on changing, because it makes it hard for investors to plan. You know, when we Konnexa started, we started with a specific business model, and we were doing an investment with Kaduna Electric. And then due to all the volatilities in the sector, the bank holding the loan for Kaduna Electric, the regulator was threatening to revoke the license of Kaduna Electric, and our investors got spooked, and they said, okay, hang on, we're not putting any more investment into this development. Let's pivot, because we're not liking the signals that are coming out of the sector. So this is how we pivoted to a trading model, because the signals coming out of the sector were spooking investors. A lot of investors are now taking the approach where, okay, let's try and find a way to invest that will, as much as possible, avoid having to interact with government agencies. So if there is a way to be minimally involved or beholden to government agencies, let's try and find that strategy, because it's too risky to say that you're going to build your model or your investment based on existing laws and existing regulations that in 3 years' time are going to change.
Wow, I see all the sisters in the room are nodding because it resonates with everyone. Just to say, yeah, I hear. Ugwem is actually doing the cheerleading stuff. Well done, well said, Hassana. But Ugwem, congratulations, Ugwem, by the way, on the merger with the Stella arrangement. I mean that's really good. I mean we ran into Stella at the Hassana, I remember at the NGF roundtable where they shared this really innovative thing they did, piece of work they did in Enugu State. Was it Enugu or Anambra State? But it was Enugu Disco was involved. How they were using AI to track losses, commercial losses, and how they were able to reduce commercial losses using the methodology they came in with. Which now brings me to a word that's come up from three of you, innovation. It's come up over and over. Hassana's resume calls it disruptive technologies. So I'm just wondering if I were to ask you to just give us 2 bullets each on when you think about innovation in Nigeria's power sector, based on what you know now, based on your international experience. Maybe I'll start with Ugwem on this one. What would be the top 2 bullets that come to mind for you?
Oh, that's a good question. I think I'm going to first lead with at the core of what I do and what Shyft does. And the first bullet would be data-driven. We need to be making bankable, data-driven decisions, and that data and the visibility that's going to come from the digitization we can achieve in time will help us make the right calls and will help things become more objective so we don't have these shifting goalposts ideally and turn this into more of an academic exercise versus one of personal passions and interest within the sector. And then I think the second bullet point, I made that a sentence, would be echoing a bit of what Hassana has mentioned. I'd say continuity. We need vision. We need continuity in that vision. We need to set these goalposts and we need to be able to keep that momentum. So maybe it's a couple messages there between continuity, vision, and momentum at the nexus of those 3 things. That's what's necessary to truly see innovation scale.
Okay, makes a lot of sense. Bankable data-driven decisions, continuity. Catherine, you're looking very thoughtful. What's brewing in that intelligent brain of yours?
So I think for me, my bullets would be local content in terms of the power sector. So I know on the distribution side, that's happening. You have manufacturers who, they're manufacturing meters now, and there's quite a lot of activities in terms of local capacity within the distribution sector. Obviously, it's been privatized, and that's why that's happened. And same with the generation sector, and that's driving efficiencies. Now, when you look at transmission, I would say local content. I would say looking at ways that we could possibly concession the grid. When you look at other countries around the world, countries in Africa, you have your grid, your grid is concession. So you have the BOT models where an institutional investor would come in, build the grid, operate it, manage it, and then transfer it. There are different models that you could look at. But they will bring in the capital that you need, or they would be able to unlock the capital that's needed to drive growth within the sector. And then local content, like I said, even if we're not yet at the stage whereby we're looking at concessioning the grid, we can still embed local content within some of the policies that are coming out from the government. So local content, especially for us where we sit now, would be things that talks to transmission lines, substations. Where can we get some level of protectionism? Like I think it was Hassana or perhaps Ugwem had said, a private investor comes in and wants to invest monies, taking out long-term loans, there's patient capital involved, you need to give a return to your shareholders. How do I know my investment is going to be protected if I don't have any type of firm laws that speak to local content? So I can say, yes, I'm going to set up a plant like you have in China and India, and I'm going to be able to roll out these towers, and these beautiful transmission towers that we need. However, what stops cheap imports from being dumped into Nigeria, And these imports come also with duty waivers. So you can bring in broken down towers into Nigeria and get an import duty waiver on them. And that, of course, makes you, as a local content player, then almost immediately not competitive. So I think a lot of work focus needs to be driven towards local content and having a robust framework around that. So I think all the stakeholders involved in the sector, we all need to come and sit down around a table and dialogue on this and come to some type of firm decisions. And then going back to what Hassana said, that would be my second thing as well. Absolutely 100% continuity. Seems like every government comes in and there's something different. So you have some initiative on power, and then 4 years down the line, it all changes. I remember when NDPHC was set up, I think it was during the Obasanjo era. And then it was all about IPPs, and there were these transmission lines that were going to be built outside of the TCN model. And then another government came in and that sort of took a back seat. And then we have new initiatives now, but like Hassana said, the goalposts just keep on changing. And that just makes for a chaotic sector, and a sector that growth will be stunted significantly. So it's almost like stop and start, chop and change. Okay, I want to plan for next year, 2025. I want to set this thing up. But then in 2 years, the laws again have all of a sudden changed. So how do you get to that point? Again, I would say maybe this to Hassana but how do you, because we all know how Nigeria works. You have a new government that comes in, it's a new party, and of course they want to do things completely different. So the rule book gets chucked out, and then you have a whole new set of decisions and initiatives and activities. So it's tricky, it's challenging. But I look to the oil and gas sector, and it has been done there. They've got the PIB, they've got the PIA, which governs how the oil and gas sectors and revenues and profit sharing in terms of oil production, how that works. And that is embedded into law, and that hasn't changed much, even with successive governments coming in. So I think a robust framework that governs all the different activities around the different value chains, I think that would give some type of stability in terms of impact, in terms of investments, and in terms of growing the sector. So those would be my sort of my two.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. One thing that's really jumping out at me as the three of you speak, I've actually never thought of, what all of this means, all of the things we say, the work we do, what it really means for the investors, right? Because a lot of our work engages more of the people on the other side of the table, the policy space. But just listening to how you contextualize all of what we're saying in terms of what it means for an investor, what policy uncertainty means for an investor, it's really quite enlightening. I hear you, Catherine. When we spoke the first time, you really talked a lot about this local content issue. I would say just keep at it. Petroleum industry bill, for example, it took forever. It took from the early 2000s into before it was finally passed in, I think, July of 2021. So I think you have something going there. So just keep saying it and just keep at it. I know that there's an ongoing initiative to do an integrated resource plan for the sector. And I know that UKNIAF is involved in that. The Federal Ministry of Power and NERC are anchoring it to have sort of like a long-term plan with different scenarios and costing for each of those scenarios, and what would it take for us to get here, and how, and what models might we adapt, which one is best for the country. Very exhaustive, sort of a 30-year plan. But of course, an integrated resource plan is a living document. The idea is to have it done and have it then backed by law, and then it's renewed rather than so the goalposts, like Hassana would say, doesn't change, but then the pathway and curves and the junctions and the bus stops might change along the way. I think countries like South Africa have done that, and it's always typically work in progress. Hopefully we get it right. Now to Hassana about that disruptive technology thing, that innovation thing you spoke of. 2 bullets?
I think it's a combination of both what Ugwem and Catherine have already stated. Number one, data. I don't think that can be stressed enough. And I always say it's as though we're afraid of data in Nigeria, because maybe data will shine a spotlight on what we don't want people to see, because I don't understand, It's just, so I think, it's so essential. And with the continued advent of new technologies, with artificial intelligence, these are ways that can make it easier, not to just to get data, but to also get verifiable and useful data. Because there is data, but it's like, is it useful and is it verifiable? So, and is it objective? So that's number one. And number two, transmission. One of the key things of automation is to drive efficiency, and efficiency in transmission is so essential in getting the sector to operate properly. And for me, it's if we can work out how private sector can work with the government to drive automation and efficiency within transmission, we will unlock a lot of potential in the power sector. I think one of the problems we see in transmission is, first of all, a lot of bureaucracy, but also it's run in such an analog way. And we see that a lot of people who have the most knowledge on the power sector are people who work in transmission and have worked there for decades. And all this knowledge and all this experience is in their heads. And how we now transfer that into the sector, and rather than keep it locked in somebody's head, is something that I think we need to be actively working on. So building that capacity by making sure that all this knowledge that is currently reposited in individuals is in the sector and used to build, grow, and improve.
Impressive. Everyone's nodding, so I think, yeah, that's a home run right there. Last word for each of you. Catherine, one thing you'd say to your younger self.
And one thing I'd say to my younger self, just keep at it, be dogged. You need to be resilient. You've got to have thick skin, work hard. Those are the things that I would say.
That's about 7 things.
7 things. Just be dogged.
Be dogged.
Be
Good
dogged.
one.
Be dogged.
Just keep at it. Stay with it.
Stay with it, yes.
Good one. Ugwem?
I think the thing I tell my younger self is it's not, one, be okay with making mistakes, but to even go further than that, to make mistakes in a way where you're failing fast. That's a common saying in the startup sector. You learn from these mistakes. At Shyft, we have a saying that we never make the same mistake twice because we're in a constant state of learning. And so I think I would have told myself to be more ambitious, be willing to take the risk, be willing to make mistakes, but also learn very quickly from them.
Impressive. Hassana, younger Hassana, what does she need to know?
I think that would be to embrace agility. I think one thing Nigeria has taught me is that you cannot be rigid, you cannot be fixed in one approach. You have to be willing to just pivot, rotate, turn around, tumble.
Goodness, what a twirl.
You know, honestly. You cannot be rigid, and also you cannot think that you know better, or that your way of doing things is the right way. And especially if you've come from different system and you've seen the way they've done it, and you think you can just import that way of doing things. That's not the case. Nigeria is a very unique country, very unique people. A lot of things that work elsewhere for some reason just cannot work here. So I think you just need to be agile. I would say be agile, be open-minded, and understand that there are ways that you haven't even thought of doing things that are maybe better. So never assume that you know the best way or your way is the right way.
Thank you very much. My goodness, this has been one of the most interesting episodes we've hosted. You ladies are amazing. I salute you. You're doing great work, and just keep at it. I think what you said to your younger self still applies to the you of today. And I hear you. I definitely hear you, and I certainly agree. And I really appreciate that you've taken the time to join this podcast. I know that a lot of our listeners would benefit from hearing you. Hope we can have you on not just the podcast, but other programs we're having subsequently. So thank you so much for being here, and thank you for your time. Thank you to our listening audience. We've come to the end of today's episode of What's with the Grid, a conversation with women in the power sector. A big thank you to the Nextier team who will be editing and packaging this in readiness for dissemination. Thank you everyone, and have a good afternoon.